Okay, I'm going to read from Romans chapter 1, verse 18, and the Amplified Version. For God's wrath and indignation are revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who in their wickedness repress and hinder the truth and make it inoperative. For that which is known about God is evident to them and made plain, because God has shown it to them. For ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature and attributes, that is his eternal power and divinity, have been made intelligible and clearly discernible in and through the things that have been made, so that men are without excuse, altogether without defence or justification. Because when they knew and recognised him as God, they did not honour and glorify him as God or give him thanks, but instead they became futile and godless in their thinking, with vain imaginings, foolish reasoning, and stupid speculations, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. So this passage can be applied to much of what we see taking place in society today, and it speaks into what I'm going to talk about today, because we see a lot of vain imaginings, foolish reasoning, and stupid speculations. So I'm going to talk about the weather and climate change. There'll be a bit about the science, data, some modelling, weather forecasting, and then look at what the Bible tells us about the subject. But first of all, I want to share a bit about my background to at least give a bit of credibility to what I'm going to say. So back in the mid-80s, I did a degree in geography and geology, and then after that I worked in computing and data for quite a long time. And then in 2000 I completed a master's degree in water and environmental management. And since then I've worked as a hydrologist, monitoring rainfall, river flow and groundwater. I'm also involved in developing river flow and groundwater models, and trained quite a number of colleagues in the use of some of the models that we use. In my earlier days I went along with the narrative. It did seem reasonable, but some of the work that I did early on involved modelling impacts of climate change, and over the time as I've looked into this more and more, I've become more sceptical about how things are currently presented. There is a distinct narrative that pervades our society, but the problem is that the narrative that has become the worldview, or at least in the Western world and in the political and business realm, is accepted irrespective of the actual evidence. It dominates the issues of the day and is endlessly promoted by the mainstream media and the authorities. This includes issues like the status of Israel, abortion, the whole LGBT agenda, how to solve certain socio-economic issues, but also subjects like evolution and climate change. And now, if you express a view contrary to the narrative, anything else you might say is discredited and worse. It's also clear that the narrative is at odds with biblical truths. In addition, we live in a time when scientists are held in high esteem. People look to scientists to answer many of the questions that face the world we live in. The problem is that scientists are not above society, but are part of it, and as such are driven by the same goals as the wider community. And they're fallible just like everyone else. There's a lot at stake: wealth and public acclaim for some, or for others just the need to secure funds to carry on a lifestyle in academia. But much of what passes for science is not that scientific, but fits the criteria outlined in the passage from Romans, i.e. vain imaginings, foolish reasoning and stupid speculations. True science can be defined as systemised knowledge derived from observation, study and experimentation. In other words, it is repeatable. Science fiction, on the other hand, is highly imaginative fiction, typically involving real or imagined scientific phenomena. And today I believe that the boundaries between science fact and science fiction are more and more blurred. There's a great deal of confusion in the public domain because all kinds of ideas and theories are published before they've been properly tested and verified. Also, people are led to believe that now we're civilized and have technology, we're in control of our environment. So what about climate change? The UN defines climate change as long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns mainly caused by human activities, especially the burning of fossil fuels. The latest reports from the media are bombarding us with headlines designed to make people fearful and convince us that we're in a climate emergency and think that we're running out of time to save the planet. When I started to put this material together, I found that one of my former lecturers wrote a book in 2008 called 7 Years to Save the Planet. And we're still here, so he was wrong and he isn't the only one. Over the years, all kinds of claims have proved to be false. As you can see from this slide, back in the 70s, there was talk about global cooling. We've had all sorts of claims about sea level rise wiping out nations, loss of rainforests, glaciers moving, and hurricanes could be on the increase or on the decrease. They make it up as they go along, and we've got more in the last few years, even with global boiling, although we don't seem to have it in the UK. So why have they come to this? For some reason, CO2 is meant to be the main culprit, but it's hard to understand why CO2 was singled out as a cause, as it only accounts for 0.04% of the atmosphere, which put another way is that only 4 molecules out of every 10,000 in the atmosphere are CO2. In fact, water vapour is also a so-called greenhouse gas, and this forms a much greater proportion of the atmosphere and is much more important in climatic systems, but that's ignored. There is natural climate change, but this is dominated by changes in the hydrological cycle, which are driven by solar and gravitational forces. Carbon dioxide appears to play only a minor role. In fact, CO2 is a primary nutrient in photosynthesis, and the recent small increases in CO2 have actually been linked to increased crop yields. So how can it be a pollutant? Increased CO2 could actually be beneficial to mankind. But according to the man-made climate change narrative, increased CO2 is supposed to lead to increased average global temperatures. However, the concept of a global average temperature is particularly misleading on a planet where at any one time the temperature could range from -50 to +40, depending on where you are. So the idea that we can control the global temperature to within a couple of degrees is laughable. From the work I do, I'd say the man's biggest influence on climate is related to land use, as urban areas, different types of agriculture and forested areas all affect the hydrological cycle in different ways. Additionally, the temperature record is one of the most abused pieces of data in the whole of the climate change debate. Proponents of man-made climate change have removed significant events from a composite historical record to try to make things look particularly bad. So this plot shows 2 reconstructed climate records. One is, some people will have come across, called the hockey stick. That's the one on the top, and it shows mainly a flat line for the last sort of 1,000 years, and then a distinct peak in the last sort of 50 or so years. And the one below is also reconstructed and is based more on events that have happened. So some of that is, without the measurements that we have now, it's hard to verify, but we know for definite that in the 1700s there were ice fairs on the Thames, and the Thames froze over. So it's clear that there was much more colder conditions back in those days, which aren't in the narrative record. The other thing is that the measured record is only about just over 100 years or so. So we're extrapolating quite a lot from not much. And then the most of that peak for the hockey stick is sort of derived from kind of modelling and assumptions. So none of it really stands up that well. So all meteorological stations are meant to conform to quite certain stringent standards, but increasingly these standards are not met, and this occurs even in the developed world. There's a great deal of evidence that key sites used for climate records have changed over time or are inappropriately positioned. it's quite important to take into consideration something called the urban heat island effect, because this is considered in some of the records when you look at them, but I think it's underplayed. So this slide shows kind of a sort of schematic of a city area, some commercial area, and then some residential zones with parks, and then rural areas on the outside. And one of the key things that we really need to consider in all of this is that basically the urban area acts as a heat sink, absorbs a lot of heat, and then gives it out. Most people have been outside their house or on a paved area after a really hot day, and they can feel the heat coming back out of either the bricks or stone or slabs or whatever, or even the concrete. And this is an important fact that's kind of, I'd like to say, not always taken account for. In fact, I think over this last few years, the nighttime temperatures have actually increased, and that's been significant in raising the overall average temperatures. So I just wanted to show a couple of examples of where there's been weather stations where things have changed and that could have influenced the records over time. So this is quite an old picture, and the point right in the middle was where there was a weather station at Pershore, and you can see to the north there's hardly any development at all. It's just a rural area, and over time there's been a lot more development, so there's more concrete, more asphalt, and that creates a heat sink. So you can see if you had any winds blowing across this area, it's potentially going to affect the temperatures that were recorded in that point. This is another indication. This is a modern temperature sensor here. It's placed right near to these bricks, and there's also some air cooling units very close by, and these are bound to impact the temperature recorded at that site. And there's hundreds of more cases of this kind of situation, and this is being fed into the record that goes into the models. So I just wanted to show how complicated the global climate sort of system is. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but you can see it's a 3D system with all kinds of movement of air from the equator up to the temperate zones, and then around the Arctic, and then with winds moving right across the globe. And that's just a schematic. So that you've got this global dynamic system that's constantly changing. The thing is, we still don't know all of the processes that are involved, and we definitely don't know how to model them effectively. Also, the model schematics are very simple. So we have this kind of gridded pattern. I think some of the models have improved a little bit in some ways. This is quite an old one, but you can see you have all of these layers and grids, and the thing is, we wouldn't have the data for all of these grids. So there's so many assumptions that are made just to get the model to work, because you wouldn't have all the data you need. And also, if you assume that the CO2 is the primary driver for temperature increase, then you can see that it's getting a bit flaky. And the results would be wrong as well. Here's just an example there's a climate scientist called John Christie, and he's presented this observations against model runs. So the bottom trace with these squares and circles and diamonds shows real measurements. And so you can see that the temperatures are going up, but not as much as the models, and all of the policies and all of the things that are going on are based on the model runs. And we can see that they are exaggerating what's going on. And here's another example. So I think in the world there's something like 20 odd institutions that are that have developed climate models, most of the main sort of G20 countries. So, and this is just a selection of them, and it's quite hard to see, but exactly what's going on. But these colours represent temperature anomalies, and you can see each of the models has slightly different results. So apart from increased temperature or everywhere boiling up, what else do they say will happen? Sea level rise is supposed to be one of the biggest dangers, but this is incredibly complicated because the sea isn't level at any time. You can measure level in a bucket or in a bath or even a lake, but to talk about average global sea level is another area of nonsense. The sea level is subject to the gravitational influence of the moon, which we see in tides, the effect of atmospheric pressure, wind, temperature of the water and salinity. And as for the ice caps melting, this happens every year in the summer, and then they refreeze in the winter, although the degree to which this happens is variable. If the sea ice melts, then there would be no change in levels because the weight of the ice displaces the water. If land-based ice melts, that could increase the amount of water in the sea, but most of the places where there are perceived changes in sea level are actually due to movements in the land. And another fairly recent feature of the narrative is the way in which weather forecasting is also sensationalising what is part of normal climate variability. Colour schemes and the naming of storms are a feature. So just moving on to this one, you can see this is a current feature having really vibrant colours. This particular one would make you think it's absolutely hot down in the Mediterranean, but you can't probably see it, but most of the temperatures that are in the 30s, which is typical Mediterranean temperatures for that time of year. But all of this gives an effect of things are warming up, when in reality it was just a regular summer. And the naming of storms is another thing that kind of adds an added dimension to the weather, which isn't really particularly helpful. We're also seeing many so-called wildfires, with the term wild meant to infer that these events are occurring naturally. But when you dig deeper into any of these instances, some are linked with arson or changes in land management that means there's more combustible material around than in the past. And if you look at what happened in Maui in Canada, there's some even more disturbing evidence. So this was one of the headlines in The Guardian. The Sky News also ran this, but after the main headline was that there were wildfires and everywhere was hot. So the truth does come out, but it's usually after the main event, and people don't always see that sometimes the reports have some truth in them. You'd think by now that there'd be some distinctive changes to our long-term weather patterns or climate if man-made climate change was actually occurring the way it's supposed to be. And you'd think we'd see some really clear differences by now. According to Carl Wunsch, who was a professor of oceanography and who was actually in the pro-lobby, he gave this quote, which I thought was kind of sums up quite a lot of where we're at. At best, the determination and attribution of global mean sea level change lies at the very edge of knowledge and technology. Both systematic and random errors are of concern, the former particularly because of the changes in technology and sampling methods over the many decades, the latter from the very great spatial and temporal variability. It remains possible that the database is insufficient to compute mean sea level trends with the accuracy necessary to discuss the impact of global warming, as disappointing as this conclusion may be. In simple terms, and this doesn't just apply to sea level, it applies to the whole climate story, the data isn't good enough and the models aren't good enough and the conclusions aren't good enough. And one of the things that led me to my position, firstly after looking at how models work, was also the data. I've got a few bits and pieces at my disposal and I can't see any trends. And if you really look at some of the papers that are looking for trends, especially in hydrology, none of them conclude that there are any trends that can be clearly defined. apart from one or two changes to the precipitation rates. So I've got a few examples that I'm going to show, and this first one is from the Severn flood wall. So at Worcester Cathedral, on the banks of the River Severn, people have placed various bricks in the wall to mark the flood levels over many years. And so we've got recent events. So we have had some high events in the last sort of 20 years. So July 2000's there, November 2000, February 2014, but May 1886, and this one you can't quite see on this slide, but that's March 1947, are higher than the most recent events, and that was before we had any climate change, or man-made climate change anyway. And this is another view. You can see better May 1886, again still not quite good, March 1947. And then I have a plot of the River Thames flow, and this is available on websites. I just copied it off the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology website, and this is the River Thames at Kingston, and this record goes back to 1883. This peak in 1894, apparently there's some dispute about that, but the highest one that we know, because this was what the highest flood recorded across most of the country and still is to this day, is 1947, same as the River Severn, one of the highest floods on record. And the interesting thing I noted, and I just plotted this without it, I didn't expect this average trend line to be almost completely flat. And then this is the Oxford historic rainfall record that goes back to 1853. So what I've done here, I've created this block chart. These sort of brown coloured squares at the front represent the minimum record on for each month. The grey are the average, and the blue represent the highest month on record. And if you look at, I don't know if you can see it, but if you can, the years represented are completely random. There is no pattern that's recognisable. Perhaps you could say for the higher rainfall, some of the 2000s are becoming prominent, but there's still dates going back to the 1800s here, and it's just a random representation of rainfall which doesn't show any pattern at all. And then this is a plot that appeared last summer when we had the very hot July, and this shows that again previous droughts or dry periods have had a greater impact on the environment in the UK than the most recent one, which was made out to be extremely bad. So I hope so far through the evidence I've shared that any of the claims made about causes of climate change through man's activities are highly exaggerated or even patently false. Because it's one thing to make these claims, but it's another to use all of this as a reason to effectively destroy the economy and people's livelihoods. So why is this happening, and what's the underlying motivation behind the propaganda? There's much more to say on that, but I'm just going to share a few quotes because I haven't got time to go into all of that detail, and it's completely another subject. But I just wanted to show a few quotes. So from the Club of Rome, which is one of the consultant to the United Nations and deemed to be a globalist group, it's quite a common quote. So it's: the common enemy of humanity is man. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine and the like would fit the bill. All of these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it's only through changed attitudes and behaviour that they can be overcome. The real enemy then is humanity itself. And then there's another one from Maurice Strong, who's a Canadian who was founder of the UN Environment Programme. I think this one dates back to the early 90s. And he said, "Isn't the only hope for the planet that the industrialized civilizations collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring this about?" And I think we can see that happening now. And then Professor Stephen Schneider, who's a professor of climatology and part of the IPCC, who are the main group that produce climate change data. We need to get some broad-based support to capture the public's imagination. So we have to offer up scary scenarios, make simplified dramatic statements, and make little mention of any doubts. Each of us has to decide what the right balance is between being effective and being honest. So who is really in control and who really knows what is happening? Thankfully, it's not the UN or the politicians or the scientists or even the media. So what does the Bible show us? It's clear that God is allowing this to happen as part of the deception and delusion that's mentioned in the Bible. But it's also clear from the scriptures that ultimately God is in control of the climate and the weather. It starts in the first verse in Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So he set the systems in place and defined the physical laws that are in operation. I don't have time to look at the pre-flood situation, as it's clearly different to the world we live in now. But after the flood, there is this key verse in Genesis 8, verse 22. And it says, "While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease." And from Genesis to Revelation, God's hand is clearly seen in event after event. So I'm just going to present a few instances, but there are lots more. And if you go, it's a big Bible study, but there's so many times God intervenes in the weather or in some way. So I'm just going to go through a few scriptures now. Firstly, in Exodus, in chapter 14, said, "Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided." And then moving on, 1 Samuel 12, verse 18, it says, "So Samuel called to the Lord, and the Lord sent thunder and rain that day, and all the people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel." And then moving on a bit further, in 1 Kings 18, "And it came to pass after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, Go present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the earth." And then I'm just going to read a few verses selected from Job. I won't give all of the references, but in Job it says, "He gives rain on the earth and sends water on the fields." And then further on he says, he withholds the water, they dry up. He sends them out, they overwhelm the earth." And then further on he says, "For he says to the snow, fall on the earth, likewise to the gentle rain and the heavy rain of his strength." And there's more in Job, more on the weather. I thought this verse in Psalm 107, verse 33 is quite a good one as well. "He turns rivers into a wilderness, and the water springs into dry ground. He turns a wilderness into pools of water, and dry land into water springs." And then with the story of Jonah, has quite a bit of weather involved as well, because it says, "The Lord sent out a great wind on the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship that Jonah was in was about to be broken up." And then at the end of Jonah, it says, "And it happened when the sun arose, that God prepared a vehement east wind, and the sun beat on Jonah's head, so that he grew faint." And then a couple of verses from the New Testament. So in Matthew 5 and verse 45 it says, "That you may be sons of your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust." And this one is particularly powerful. It's when Jesus was in the boat with the disciples, and he calmed the storm. So this is in Matthew 8 verse 27. It says, "Who can this be that even the winds and the sea obey him?" And additionally, Ecclesiastes in chapter 1 verses 6 and 7 describes both the jet stream and then the hydrological cycle. And for anyone concerned about sea level rise, there's 4 instances where it says that God sets the boundaries on the sea. So they're in Job 38 verses 8 to 11, Psalm 104 verse 9, Proverbs 8:29 and Jeremiah 5:22. And there are many more weather-related passages, but I don't have time to go into those. Also, there are many future climate weather events outlined in Revelation and the other prophetic writings that are ultimately God's judgments. But those, again, is another area of subject where we're talking about the situation now. So, to conclude, climate change, is it our fault? I don't think so. The underpinning science is fundamentally flawed, as are the models, much of the data, and many of the assumptions. The biblical evidence of who's actually in control of the planet is overwhelming. There's no doubt that some of our activities cause damage to the earth, and we're definitely responsible for the exploitation and wastefulness of the resources that we've been given. So as stewards of the earth, we've done a poor job overall. The job done to make evolution the accepted view of the past without God has taken place since Darwin and is complete. And in the last 40 to 50 years there's been this push to create the future without God in the form of a man-made climate catastrophe. And this is ramping up and appearing to be successful. The global leadership claim they want to save the world at the expense of people, but God wants to save people because he's going to create a new heaven and a new earth. And there's more information on that in Isaiah 65, Matthew 24, 2 Peter and Revelation 21.